Hello everyone, I'm Kay and this is Kay Talks Writing, where it's my goal to give you a quick and meaningful writing lesson that you can put into action right away. Episode 1, I'm going to talk about taking advice, receiving feedback, and following all those big rules of writing that it feels like people are always talking about. You know, rules like never change point of view in the middle of a scene, and only ever use said as your dialogue tag, and never use said as your dialogue tag, and my favorite, avoid sentimentality. That was big when I was in my undergrad program, and it was a lot of fun because it was both absolutely mandatory and absolutely meaningless. In order to enter the creative writing program at all, we had to go through an application process that included a short story that avoids sentimentality. I went around to several different professors to ask what that meant, and I got two different answers. One was no genre fiction, which meant no adventures, thrillers, magic, or spaceships. The other answer, and by far the more common one, was I don't know what that means. I submitted a ghost story in defiance of both answers and was accepted into the program anyway. It took me a long time to figure out what the creative writing professors actually meant. What even they somehow didn't even know how to say. And I could do an entire episode about avoiding sentimentality. But what I really learned from that experience was not how to avoid sentimentality. What I learned was to look at someone's specific and clear instructions not as clear instructions. This is art, so just know that anyone being 100% prescriptive about what you need to do with it is not giving you the best advice. But instead, see clear instructions as an attempt to communicate something that they believe is helpful. So, in short, what they really meant by avoid sentimentality was to not get hung up on melodrama and plot twists, but to actually communicate an authentic human moment. In a sentimental story, a father loses his job, can't provide for his family, spends the story crying, and you expect the reader to be moved. In a story that strives for authentic humanity, a father loses his job and faces his children, and the way that the father's sadness plays against his ability to seek comfort from his loved ones touches on something that exists equally in all of us, making the reader uncomfortably aware of the fact that there is a small but essential space of misunderstanding that will always exist between themselves and those they love most. When you set aside sentimentality, you realize that a truly moving story isn't defined by the tears in the character, but by the discomfort in the reader. And because the creative writing department at the university didn't have the time or infrastructure to teach this specific lesson to all professors and prospective students, the best they could do was to write avoid sentimentality on the application form and hope that between whatever creative writing intro classes we'd already taken and our own artistic tastes and talents, we could figure some part of that out. Understanding that the point of storytelling isn't to set up a moving plot twist, but instead to twist the knife in the reader's soul, was part of what the application process was testing, whether that was intended or not. And the thing is, all feedback, suggestions, and quote-unquote rules of fiction writing work like this. There is an immensity of meaning and intent that lies behind our attempts to communicate artistic values. But the art in its creation is so cerebral that the best we can do is say, the characterization isn't working for me, or the dialogue is stilted, or what if you do the same story but without ghosts in it? Here's another example from way further along in my career. I sent a space opera novella to a call for submissions, and I received a request for rewrites. That means I wasn't outright rejected, but the story wasn't good enough to accept, so I was politely asked to fix it and try again. I got feedback from 4 different editors. Most of this was easy stuff. For instance, I was told that the names of the sides that the heroes and the villains were on were too similar, and one of the editors got confused. So it was the Confederacy versus the Consortium. So yes, fair enough, those words are too similar. Easy fix, nothing complicated there. Another point, the backstory for my protagonist was communicated too late in the book. I respectively disagreed, but I did understand how some readers might feel that way. With an entire book as my canvas, I was able to add a few quick details to earlier chapters, and honestly, it did make the draft stronger, so good stuff. Again, nothing super complicated. Not all the feedback I got was so easy, though. An essential component of my science fiction setting is that cybernetic technology is banned inside the Confederacy. One editor said this was confusing and that my attempts to explain this were taking up too much of the book, so the cybernetics ban should just be removed from the setting entirely. Full stop, there's no way I was going to do that. For one, the feedback was too prescriptive for my taste. This wasn't advice on how to make some scenes or plot beats more effective, but a call for a complete overhaul of something that I believed was an essential plot point without which the novel could not function. Now, sometimes you do get feedback like this. It's tempting to just assume that the person giving it didn't read carefully, which does happen sometimes. Sometimes people just don't get your story, but I was sure that wasn't the case here. I respected the person giving this advice, and I didn't want to throw it out, but there was also no way in the world I was going to implement it. So what was I supposed to do with it? Well, I needed to understand that the story as it exists in my head is not the story I've written. Once it's on the page, I have no say in how it interacts with the reader, nor is the story on the page the story that exists in the reader's head. The only place that the story actually exists in a way that really matters is inside the reader's imagination. I got feedback from 4 different editors, each of whom had a unique interpretation of my book, which means that there were essentially 4 different versions of this story. And in one of those versions, there was something about the cybernetics ban that didn't make sense. There's clearly a disconnect between what I had intended and what was received, and therein lay the problem. So it became my job not to remove the cybernetics ban, but to make it work correctly. The editor advised that I remove it, so instead I wrote more about it. It became my job to convince this editor in the next draft that this was an essential part of the plot, and that it did fulfill things in a way that was important and worthwhile. Not saying this is how you should always react, just that this is how I did react, because I knew my story and I knew what I wanted. Remember that the goal of good feedback should always be to help the writer achieve their goals for the story. If anyone gives you feedback that tries to change your story to be something other than what you want it to be, it's your job to do one of 3 things. Either 1, revisit what you wanted it to be if you think the advice is good, 2, reinterpret the advice to help you achieve your goals, or 3, ignore the advice and carry on. Do very rarely pick option 3. All reactions to your work have some kind of value, just sometimes that value is understanding that not everyone's going to get your work, and you need to accept that. Most advice and feedback will end up going through some version of this lens. Sometimes it's straightforward advice that you can implement directly if you want, but more often you'll go to think about it or work on that advice and end up doing something different with it. Neither ignoring it nor just doing what you're told, but instead learning from it and re-engaging with your art in a way that is authentic and unique to you. Hopefully in a way that nobody else would know how to suggest. I mean, there's exceptions. Some advice is simple and small and not worth that depth, and sometimes you're a student and your professor actually literally wants you to try something for the purpose of learning it. And that's where writing rules come in. These are the rules you learn as a student about how to negotiate point of view, dialogue tags, sentence construction, scene structure, plot pacing, all those essential elements like that. A lot of these things are prescriptive, like don't use passive voice, and avoid long sentences, and don't use indirect speech in the middle of a conversation. But if you do enough reading in the canon, you'll find incredible stories that do all of these things. With writing rules like this, it's not like they're free to interpret and ignore, except that they are completely free to interpret and ignore. The entire point is that you need to have a good reason to do that, and you need to understand how it affects the story when you do. It just turns out that the only way to have that knowledge is to spend a lot of time following the rules so that you completely understand how and why they are what they are. And only then are you likely to succeed in breaking them. Some writers eventually communicate in indirect speech constantly, and some writers use half-page sentences on the regular. But they get away with this because before they started doing that, they figured how to not do that, why it's important to not do that, and what it means when they do. Like with feedback, engaging with the so-called mandatory rules of writing comes down to a thorough understanding with why you're being told to do what you're being told to do, and being able to make informed decisions about why you might choose to do or not do that, and what effect that might have on your story when it hits the mind of your reader. If you've never bothered to figure out what the rules of writing are and why you might want to follow them, then you might not do a very good job of breaking them. In my undergrad education, avoid sentimentality was a mandatory rule. Learning to create our own understanding of that rule and engage with it was an important part of our education. A lot of us got into writing because we loved twist-filled thrillers or adventure stories, but if we just coasted through our educations without learning how to write stories that don't fall back on thriller tropes for cheap emotional climaxes, we wouldn't have figured out how to sharpen those twists to an edge that could actually cut our readers. When I moved on to my graduate program, the rule of avoid sentimentality didn't exist anymore. By then, we'd learned well enough how to avoid sentimentality that we could be trusted instead to wield sentimentality for greater effect. We'd also learned how to give feedback that helped other writers achieve their goals instead of just pushing them to write more like us, and how to interpret feedback in a looser and more liberating way. Hopefully, any advice I give you in this podcast is taken in a similar way. Okay, on my way out, let me go ahead and introduce myself. I'm Kay, and I've been writing a long time. I've got a master's in fine arts. I've taught fiction writing both in college and in community workshops. I've got a few books behind me and a small pile of short stories, essays, and poems, which include both literary writing and more sentimental genres like sci-fi, fantasy, thriller, and horror. In my life, I've received a lot of writing advice, and I've given even more. For this podcast, I'm going to be looking at the lessons I've taught and the lessons I've learned and crushing them down to quick, effective talks that you can implement right away. It is my hope that you listen to this podcast, and once it's done, you're just a little bit better of a writer. Just remember, all the advice I give you is just my attempt to communicate something about the big, complicated art we all love, and you can do whatever you want with it. The background music is by an artist who calls himself Savk. That's S-A-V-F-K. You can look him up at youtube.com/savkmusic. I've got no sales pitch and no product to plug. I'll drop my socials later if this podcast actually gets some listeners. For now, go do some writing and then have someone read it and tell you what they think. It'll be a little uncomfortable, but pretty cool. Good luck, get creative, give the podcast a like, follow, whatever, and come back and listen again next time. Bye for now.